Part 3 to a pocket guide to the Empire and its environs. Cyrodiil, the Imperial province. Cyrodiil, Dragon Empire, starry heart of Nirn, the seat of sundered kings. Indeed, if the history of the Nords is the history of humans on Tamriel, then Cyrodiil is the throne from which they will decide their destiny. It is the largest region of the continent, and most is endless jungle. Its centre, the grassland of the Nibene Valley, is enclosed by an equatorial rainforest and broken up by rivers. As one travels south along these rivers, the more subtropical it becomes. And finally, the land gives way to the swamps of Argonia and the placid waters of the Topal Bay. The elevation rises gradually to the west and sharply to the north. Between its western coast and its central valley, there are all manner of deciduous forests and mangroves becoming sparser towards the ocean. The western coast is a wet, dry area, and from Rihad border to Anvil to the northernmost Valenwood villages, forest fires are common in summer. There are a few major roads to the west, river paths to the north, and even a canopy tunnel to the Velothi Mountains, but most of Cyrodiil is a river-based society surrounded by jungle. Cyrodiilic history truly begins by the middle of the Alessian Reformation, when civilization and cultivation had allowed the region to emerge as a discernible Tamrielic power. Its culture and military strength centered in the sacred Nibene Valley, a grassland expanse with a vast lake at its heart. Several small islands rose from this lake, and the capital city sprawled across them, crisscrossed with bridges and gondola ferries. Rivers connected the city-state to both its profitable outlying territories and the friendly inland ports of Skyrim and Palatine. Rice and textiles were its main exports, along with the esoteric treasure goods such as hide armor, moon sugar, and ancestor silk. The sheer size of Cyrodiil's physical theatre and frequent intervals of elven tyranny made its unification as a whole a slow and oft interrupted process. At the height of the Alessian influence, its western arm enjoyed a brief autonomy as the Clovian Estates, a demarcation that still colours an outsider's view of the empire today. Often, Cyrodiil has two faces, east and west, and any discussion of its later social history must first be tempered with a summary of this early divergence. Traditionally, the East is regarded as the region's soul, magnanimous, tolerant, and administrative. It was in the rainforests of the Nibene Valley that the original Syro-Nordic tribes, the Nibenese, learned a self-reliance that separated them culturally and economically from Skyrim. The elven harassment of the First Empire gave rise to an elite form of support troop for the valley armies, the Battle Mage. By the time the Alessian doctrines filtered down from the north along the river tradeways, these mages had become the ruling aristocracy. They were quickly superseded by the Alessian priesthood, whose inexplicably charismatic religion found purchase in the lower classes. The traditional Nordic pantheon of 8 divines was replaced by a more baroque veneration of ancestor spirits and god animals, practices encouraged by the mutable yet monotheistic doctrines of the Alessian faith. The doctrines eventually codified nearly every aspect of Eastern culture. Restrictions against certain kinds of meat eating, coupled with the sentiments of blossoming animal cults, soon made agriculture and husbandry nearly impossible. Thus, many of the eastern Cyrodiils were forced to become merchants, which, over time, allowed the Nibene Valley to become the wealthiest city-state in the region. Yet, under Alessian rule, no matter how rich or powerful the merchant class became, it was still a tenanted citizenry, and the tithes they were forced to pay the priesthood were constant reminders of the state's true masters. The West is respected as Cyrodiil's iron hand, firm, unwavering, and ever vigilant. The Syro-Nords that settled it had relinquished the fertile Nibene Valley long ago, determined to conquer the frontier. Their primitive ferocity was disinclined to magic or the need for industry, preferring instead bloody engagement and plunder. After they had captured the Nedic port cities of the Strident coast, the Westerners embarked on a mastery of the sea. Their earliest voyages took them as far as the Lilac Bay and the Cape of the Blue Divide, whose ports they annually raided until the then superior Yakutan navies arrived, around First Era 810. By the time of the Alessian Reformation, the Westerners were firmly in a position, both geographically and socially, to resist its doctrines. Hammerfell, its northern border state, was now protected by its own wholly avenging order, the Ragada, whose bloody intolerance for foreigners acted as West Cyrodiil's buffer against the Alessian priesthood. The pantheon of 8 divines, therefore, survived unchecked in western Cyrodiil, and relations with the increasingly Alessian East became strained. Ultimately, the West isolated itself from the theocratic hegemony of the Nibene Valley, establishing an autonomous government, the Colovian Estates. Things persisted in this vein until the Thracian Plague of First Era 2200, which decimated more than half of Tamriel's population, particularly the western coastlands closest to Thrace. After Bendu Olo, the Colovian king of Anvil, led the All-Flags navy to victory over the slugfolk of Thrace, the glory of the Cyrodiilic people became known throughout the world. The Colovian Estates began to overshadow the richer, more populous East then, which eventually led to the War of Righteousness that ended Alessian rule. Control of the Nibene Valley reverted to a mercantile magocracy that was still far too arcane for Western tastes to entertain a reunification of Cyrodiil. 400 years would pass before that would happen, when Raman I, another proud son of the West, rallied the Valley's army to join his own and fight the Akaviri Invasion of First Era 2703. The Cyrodiilic forces engaged the Akaviri in every region of the north, eliciting their surrender at last in the Pale Pass of Skyrim. By the war's end, the Cyrodiils found themselves not only united as a nation, but too responsible for the further protection of the northern human kingdoms at large. When the elves of the Somerset Isles took umbrage at what they perceived as a renewed human imperialism, Raman was forced to prove them right. In order to prevent the elves from attacking the already weakened northern kingdoms, he offered the captive Akaviri horde amnesty in his future dominions if they would serve as the nucleus of his army of the Second Empire of Men. Raman's own dynasty lasted for 200 years, and in that span it conquered all the kingdoms of Tamriel, except Morrowwind. Indeed, the dark elven Morag Tong were the doom of Raman's heirs, and the death of the last true Cyrodiilic emperor heralded the beginning of the Common Era. The Cyrodiilic Empire endured for another 400 years under the auspices of the Akaviri Potentate, fell and suffered a similar span of years in the insurrections, misrules and loss of power known as the Interregnum. Yet, the remnants of the Cyrodiilic Empire refused to die, even though both East and West had become fragmented beyond measure. A petty king of the Colovian Estates, Cuchulainn Cain, came to power and appointed Anatborn as general of his legions. General Talos had studied in Skyrim and used the Thu'um. He could rout entire armies with his battle cry and shout lesser men off their feet. A year later, more than half of the Cyrodiilic Empire was reclaimed or consolidated, and Cuchulainn Cain saw fit to move into the Nibene Valley, capture the Imperial city and proclaim himself emperor. By this point, Highrock and Skyrim, which bitterly opposed the return to Cyrodiilic rule, gathered their armies for a joint invasion of the Colovian West. Talos met them on the field of Sancretor. The Nords that had come to cripple the empire soon joined the general's forces, for when they heard his Thu'um, they realized he was Skyrim's son and heir to the Empire of Men. The Bretons were sent back to Highrock with tales of Cuchulainn Cain's new general, where they decided to combat the Emperor's sorcery with their own. In Common Era 854, a Nightblade from the Western Reach made his way to the Imperial Palace at Nibene. There, the Witchman assassinated the Emperor, caught the palace on fire, and slit the throat of General Talos. Quote, "But from the smouldering ruin he came, one hand to his neck, and with Cuchulainn Cain's crown in the other. The legions wept at this sight. His northern magic had saved him, but the voice that led them would be more silent from that night on. His word would no longer rout an army with a roar, but he could still command one with a whisper. He took for himself a Cyrodiilic name, Tiber Septim, and the Nordic name of kings, Ysmir, the dragon of the north. And with those names he took, too, the red diamond crown of the Cyrodiils, and became their true emperor. Thus was born the Third Empire of Men." Cyrodiil in the Third Empire is the young, vital embodiment of its ancient heritage, Internally, it has undergone an incredible restoration. Reconstruction of the ruined sections of the Imperial city is nearly complete. Roads and cities destroyed in the interregnum have been rebuilt. East and West are unified for the first time in 4 centuries. Cyrodiil's present stability and strength have not been seen since the Roman dynasty. Indeed, they were born under similar circumstances, a Westerner winning the Eastern throne, forging them both into the greatest power in Tamriel. And now, in but 20 years' time, Tiber Septim has secured Imperial authority in Highrock, Skyrim and Hammerfell. Every human region stands with him against the elven menace. The Emperor has gracefully attributed his successes to his peoples, the Colovians and the Nibbenese, whose cultures we shall now treat in their current incarnation. The Colovians today still possess much of the frontier spirit of their ancestors. They are uncomplicated, self-sufficient, hearty, and extremely loyal to one another. Whenever the East would tremble under the weakness of a leader, the Colovians would withdraw unto themselves, always believing that they were keeping the national spirit safe until the storm passed. They realized that the Nibbenese Valley is the heart of the empire and the cultural center of its civilization. But it is a fragile center that only can be held together by the strength of character of its emperor. When he falters, so do the Colovians. Yet when he is mighty, like Tiber Septim, they are his legions. Today, West Cyrodiils make up the majority of the soldiers in the Ruby ranks. The Colovian nobility, all officers of the Imperial legions or its West Navy, do not allow themselves the great expenditure of courtly life, as is seen in the capital city. They prefer immaculate uniforms and stark standards hanging from the ceiling of their austere cliff fortresses. To this day, they become a little perplexed when they must visit the grandly decorated assault of colour that is the Emperor's palace. By contrast, the eastern people of Cyrodiil relish in garish costumes, bizarre tapestries, tattoos, brandings, and elaborate ceremony. Closer to the wellspring of civilization, they are more given to philosophy and the evolution of ancient traditions. The Nibbenese find the numinous in everything around them, and their different cults are too numerous to mention. The most famous are the cult of the Ancestor Moth, the cult of Heroes, and the cult of Tiber Septim, and the cult of Emperor Zero. To the Colovians, the ancestor worship and esoteric customs of the East can often be bizarre. Akaviri dragon motifs are found in all quarters, from the high minaret bridges of the Imperial city to the paper hako skiffs that villagers use to wing their dead down the rivers. Thousands of workers ply the rice fields after the floodings, or clear the foliage of the surrounding jungle in the alternate seasons. Above them are the merchant nobility, temple priests and cult leaders, and the age-old aristocracy of battle mages. The Emperor watches over them all from the towers of the Imperial city as dragons circle overhead. And so concludes part 3 of A Pocket Guide to the Empire and its Environs. Part 4 will be on the Breton province of Highrock.